Anyway, I thank you for inviting me to speak here at your conference. My background there is a uh, overhead aerial view of the Rogers Memorial Farm where I do most of my work. That is here in eastern Nebraska. I'm going to show you some observations from there, but not a lot of data because when it comes to our yields versus your yields, when it comes to our rainfall versus your rainfall, when I say your, the panhandle, we are different. Soils are different. But some of the observations are going to hold true no matter where we're at. The presentation title assigned to me was no-till, the systems approach to no-till and soil health. I think no-till is just a tool. What I like about no-till is the residue and what it does for us. When it comes to soil health, one of the main things I look at is the soil biology. And so I sort of changed the title slide just a little bit to think about the systems approach. And when it comes to the systems approach, we want to think about how each step affects the next and how each step builds upon the previous step and how a lot of times that building is on into the future. It's not an immediate response tomorrow. Or like Humberto was saying, you may or may not get a yield increase now, but I was pleased on his data where he showed that there were some things that showed up after the 5 or 10 years of use of cover crops. So again, that systems approach, we can do that. We got to start thinking about it. When it comes to, all right, now my slides won't agree or won't advance. Hang on, exit, come back, maybe. There we go. When it comes to systems approach to no-till, one of the things we like no-till is tillage has always been a negative when it comes to things like the amount of soil structure. Tillage always destroys soil structure. When it comes to the amount of residue left on the soil surface, when it comes to keeping an environment there for sustaining biological life. So tillage is negative there. That's why we're using the no-till tool. And as we think about it, we think about the soil itself. I like to draw it as a bar graph rather than a pie chart, but the soil is half there, half not there. The half that is there are your solids. It's your organic matter, it's your mineral matters, it's your nutrients, it's everything that's living there in the soil as well as what makes up the soil. The half that's not there is the pore space between the soil particles. And ideally, it's about half air, half water. Now, after heavy rain, there's more water, less air. As we use that water to grow something, or it evaporates, there's more air, less water. And so that pore space is sort of like a lung breathing in and out. And so we got to start thinking about that soil as our warehouse to store everything we need for crop production, is also our factory where a lot of the work is being done. And when it comes to engineers, we've studied a lot of soil properties. And one of the things we study a little bit is compaction. What's soil moisture content for best soil moisture content for doing tillage was work that was done years ago. Well, I'm here to say that here's one of the worst things you can do: drive on or till a wet soil. Those soil particles are lubricated. They slide easily under that weight of the implement. That's where you cause compaction. And compaction is that loss of pore space between soil particles. We've all seen ruts out there. We know that's compaction. What we a lot of times don't realize is that tillage itself is causing compaction because we're losing pore space between those soil particles. And so that rut shows up as reduced height. And that's why I like the bar graph here. So that pore space is reduced. The solids are non-compressible. And so since we have less pore space, we store less water, we have less air. And soil that's been tilled has some compaction in it, gets wet faster after a rain, dries out faster when it quits raining. It's simply because we don't have as much storage space there. And so what we want to do is build that soil structure, and that's part of the systems approach. And that tillage compaction, a little times is a little harder to see unless you've got a comparison. This happened to be on a tour of the K-State Manhattan Bottom farms. And you can see the no-till plots look taller than the tilled plots. And again, that's because tillage has beat down the soil structure, has reduced the pore space. The no-till is a less dense soil. And again, we saw a few numbers there on bulk densities and longer term no-till can be less. So we're seeing that improvement in the soil structure. Now, I said driving on or tilling the wet soil, even if the soil is dry, we're not doing ourselves a favor when it comes to tillage. That tillage itself, again, is breaking up the soil structure, breaking up the residue, burying it. And out there in the Panhandle, we had a field day many years ago where we dug some soil pits. This is a soil pit from a wheat fallow field where there was a lot of tillage strips during that fallow period. The soil surface is just above this slide. Within the tillage zone itself, basically tillage has eliminated every pore space there is. And that is a massive dense soil then, very hard for water and roots to penetrate. The interesting thing there in the middle is some layers there, which was where sweeps run at different depths. You could actually pull out those layers and see the sweep smear marks on there. But what I love to show you is that below that, between freeze thaw, wetting and drying, roots, everything else is going on in the soil, there's some beautiful vertical structure there. Except we've come along with tillage there and erased that structure. So again, build that structure so water can penetrate in the soil. It's not going to run off, or roots can penetrate. So again, we want to build that structure all the way to the soil surface. Now, this was a wheat fallow rotation. His wheat looks something like this. Again, that soil was finally tilled because I did, depend upon the year, anything from 15 to 20 tillage trips between that wheat harvest and then a year, 14 months later, the wheat planting. So again, there's no structure there. Very little soil biology there. When I walked out there and took this picture, I should have did a little better footprint. Compare that soil to this soil. Here's Neil Armstrong's first footprint on the moon. We all know there's no life on the moon. Is that soil look that much different than this tilled soil from the wheat fallow? Again, we've destroyed the soil life, the soil biology by doing all that tillage. So when it comes to the systems approach, we got to start thinking about how did Mother Nature build soil? There's a soil pit again. I'm out there in the Panhandle showing the native soil structure. We can see some vertical structure there. We can see some dark there, the organic matter. As Humberto pointed out, that's the roots adding biomass to the subsoil, the carbon biomass. That's one thing that's easy to measure. The one thing that's a little harder to measure is the root exudates. As the roots are giving off exudates, they're adding carbon to the soil as well. And that's how Mother Nature built our soils, by having a living root out there almost year round, putting, yes, biomass in the soil, but more importantly, putting the root exudates out into the soil, adding carbon to that soil itself. So again, we got to start thinking about that, what we're doing in our field conditions. And when we start thinking about soil health principles or conservation agriculture, now here in the United States, we call it no-till. You go to the rest of the world, they're going to call it conservation agriculture. We don't do that here because we had the term conservation tillage before. And to be truthful, the word conservation and tillage don't belong in the same sentence when you start thinking about it. But when it comes to the soil health principles, I want minimal soil disturbance. Again, that's where no-till is a tool to do that. I want to keep the soil covered. That's where residue does that for us, or a growing crop or vegetation. That's where cover crops can come in. Also, I want a diversity of plants. It's just like you and I, we like a diversity in our diet when we eat. Our soil and our soil microbes do as well when it comes to building soil health. And that's where diversity helps a lot. The living roots in the soil, that's again to get the carbon exudates into that soil system year round, or as close to year round as possible. Again, Mother Nature did that by having a living root out there year round, may have been only actively growing, 9, 10, 11 months a year, depending on where you're at, what your winters were like. But we, or our ancestors, came in and says, well, let's till up all that native stuff. Let's plant a row crop or a wheat crop or whatever. And we only had a living root out there for maybe 5 months a year. Again, we're behind the 8 ball when it comes to growing some biomass. We're behind by getting the root exudates. So that's why I want the living root close to year round as possible. Now, integrating livestock, the research I do not have livestock at the Rogers Memorial Farm, but there's a lot of people who like to integrate livestock. And we're going to hear a presentation this afternoon on livestock, how it fits in as well. But again, we start thinking about these principles. And again, as the engineer, I've been studying tillage systems for years. And when it comes to the tillage systems, minimal soil disturbance, Again, it's the no-till on that far left side there. But we start thinking about the systems approach. You know, we used to plow, we used to disc, we used to do a lot of things to make that system work. Well, we got to think about the systems approach when it comes to no-till as well. It's not in the tillage itself. It's not parking the tillage tools. It's managing year-round, system around, rotation around. And the key thing here is look in front of this equipment. Uniform height of residue, uniform spread of residue, systems approach. We have to think about our next step in the field when we're doing our harvest, for instance. And this is one of our fields already planted. I learned to no-till back as first started working with in 1978. 1978, we didn't have all the modern technologies we have today. We didn't have all the GMOs and herbicide resistance and things like this. But again, when it comes to the systems approach, notice how uniform spread that residue is. When it comes to uniformity in the field, that's one of the keys I want. Uniform spread of residue, uniform plant stands. Some people ask, why don't you move the residue? I go, why? Right now, every seed is under the same residue cover in the same soil temperature, in the same moisture content. That's going to give you a most uniform growth for maximum yields. So again, we got to think about what we're doing out there in the field. Again, spread that residue. When it comes to spreading residue, we've done a lot of improvements as we start adopting reduced till and no-till systems. We're seeing better chaff and straw distribution. You know, it used to be you put things out there in the windrow, maybe because we were baling it up, maybe we weren't, but it was still out there in the windrow. That becomes hard to work with. Out there in your panhandle area, there's a lot of interest in the stripper header. Stripper head, basically, we don't have to spread the residue because we're just taking the berries off the top. We still have to spread the chaff out the back, but again, makes it a lot easier. Now, also in your program this afternoon is Mark Watts is going to talk about no-till. This is a picture of his from a few years ago, planting into that stripper head harvested wheat stubble. It can be done. That residue there is really protecting the soil surface for him. Now, back in our end of the state, our combine, our research farm, we don't have a stripper header. We use regular platform head. We spread the residue. We don't run straw choppers anymore. For us, the straw choppers break the residue open too much, breaks down too quickly. I want it to hang around. And it's because we got a biology active soil. We try to cut our crops as high as we can, because if the residue is standing upright, anchored, and attached, then our planting equipment or our fertilizer equipment, whatever, doesn't have to cut it. It just sort of slides down between it. And again, we've been planting, like I say, I started in 1978, the farm itself. 1981, I started some research plots. The entire farm got changed to no-till in the mid-80s. Again, leave the residue anchored and attached. 1981, I did start a tillage study where I was going to compare different tillage systems. And I had 6 different tillage systems, and this is just an example many years later after this project's been going. On the left side is tilled. We got some soybeans in dry soil. We got some soybean seed under crust. On the right side, the no-till, virtually every bean is up and growing. We get better stands with our no-till because we know where the moisture is. That residue there protects that seed zone from drying out. This happens to be the year it was soybeans into grain sorghum residue. But again, when it comes to the pore space and soil particles, take a look on the left side. That is a physically about 4 inches lower elevation than the right side. Tillage has beat down that structure. And so again, that no-till soil becomes more resilient because it has more storage there for water, has better air and gas exchange, has better infiltration. And these things start to add up. Now, about from where that picture was taken, dug a soil pit there a few years ago and took this picture. Those arrows show that we are where there's a tillage pan there, a disc pan. And it's it is almost to the line from where the tillage stops and no-till begins. That pan just sort of ends right there. Notice on the no-till side, better structure. The organic matter is down deeper into the soil. And again, it's the root exudates and the root biomass that build our soils down deeper. Now, a few years ago, I got ambitious enough to find someone to take the soil samples for me. I went down to 6 feet deep, and here it is broken down in inches. At 0 to 4 inch depth, that sort of purple on the left side is plowed, sky blue on the right side of each set of bars here is the no-till. with chisel and disc treatments in between. In that upper layer, yes, there's a lot more carbon. People expect that in no-till. But as you go down in depth, that 6 to 16, 8 to 16 inches, 16 to 32, there's more carbon down there in the no-till. Again, that's because the root exudates are putting carbon into the soil system as well as the root biomass. When we start thinking about building carbon in the system, we're going to build organic matter. And that's where I appreciated Jay's comments about organic matter. That's one of the things we want to build when it comes to soil health. And when it comes to low water conditions, especially out there in the panhandle, if we can build organic matter, it becomes a better sponge to hold water. And when it comes to 1% organic matter, if I could build it up to 3%, it'll take me a few years. I can't do it overnight, but by growing cover crops and getting rid of fallow periods and having that living root year round, I can give me at least 50% more water stored, and that extra stored water becomes extra yield. So again, we want to make sure we can build our organic matters. Now, when it comes to improving our soil, there's a lot of other things we'll look at too. But like I say, one of the first things is I'm going to switch to no-till. And I've been working with no-till since 78. In the 80s, I had some grants where I was actually going out and helping producers like yourselves adopt no-till. And we're working with about 30 to 50 farmers a year through the 80s. And here's one of the guys that worked with in the mid 80s. Nothing new, nothing special for the equipment. He had his old furrow openers from years of tillage, used them to knock the residue over and planting no-till. So again, we got to start thinking about, let's stop the tillage, start building the soil system. Those furrow openers were on for a reason. Back in tillage days, we dried out the soil. We made some clods. We had to push away the dry soil on clods to find some moisture in the seed bed to plant into. The good news is, as we get into the no-till and build soil structure, that residue protects that soil. We don't have it all dried out. We don't need those residue movers or furrow openers on our planters. So we got to start thinking about it. Now, again, when it comes to what's happening in the field, a lot of people say, well, what's no-till worth? I look at water. It's worth a lot when it comes to out west. The typical silt loam soil holds around 1.5 inches, 2 inches available water per foot, maybe 2.5 if you got some higher organic matter. You stir it about 6 inches deep. We all know it dries out. You lose about half of that water, so 1/2 to 3/4 inch of water lost. It might cost you a little bit for fuel, yes. Might cost you a little bit in custom rate. Custom rate might be higher now, but you still find someone might do it for $10 an acre. And again, in today's economy, that doesn't sound like much. But what if I did 3 tillage trips, lost 1/2 inch each time? That's why I had the furrow openers on tilled systems. Now, when it comes to the tillage, though, the worst thing is I lose the residue. I lose the soil structure. I lose the water stable aggregates. And as Roberto pointed out, we have less water stable aggregates and more erosion. So again, that's where I don't like the tillage. I want to leave that residue out there to work for me. That residue absorbs raindrop impact, so it reduces that erosion. It also keeps the sun and wind off the soil surface to reduce evaporation. And when it comes to water savings, that's where I find that the benefits to really start to pay off. Norm Clockey used to be our extension irrigation specialist out there at North Platte. Here's 2 different years where he had bare soil out there and he just planted a crop in some area it did not. Just by having a growing crop there, keeping the sun and wind off the soil surface reduced evaporation. Now, people will say, yeah, I always grow a crop. Well, no, didn't used to when we had wheat fallow. If we had fallow with nothing growing there, there was a lot of evaporation. I could afford to spend a little bit of that water to grow a cover crop, get the sun and wind off the soil surface, and actually be water ahead as long as I didn't let that cover crop use too much water. Because right here, we're seeing 6, 7 inches of water lost to evaporation just by not having something growing. So again, we got to start thinking about properly managing that cover crop if we're using it. Now, Norm was doing this where he actually had the crop planted and added some residue there as well. Well, again, on the bare soil, having residue there reduced evaporation, cut it roughly 30 to 50%. Even under the crop canopy, it cut it roughly 30 to 50%. So again, that combination of having something there plus the residue can greatly reduce that evaporation. Dave Nielsen worked out at ARS in Akron, found that standing wheat stubble can actually save about 2 inches of water during the non-crop season. Now, he also says if the soil profile can retain that water. Again, that's where I want to build a soil structure with more pore space that can retain that water, more organic matter, so it can hold it like a sponge. So again, by that systems approach to building soil health, building organic matter, building soil structure, then we can start storing some of this water to use later in the season. So again, that little bit of water lost up front, lose a lot more to evaporation. And a lot of it comes down to, did we have residue there in the field or not? Now that residue absorbs raindrop impact. Yes, that's a component of erosion. But another thing that a lot of people haven't thought about is crusting. That raindrop impact causes crust. Now, this farmer is concerned about his corn coming up and he's picking there with a screwdriver, and you can't quite see it probably on your computer screen, but there are some corn seedlings trying to spike up through that. I look at that crust the other direction though. If it's there, water cannot soak in. We're going to have more runoff. So I want that residue out there to reduce crusting so I get more infiltration. And again, for my long-term tillage plots, this is a tile spade full of soil from the no-till on the left side. We can see some good soil beds, some good aggregates, pore space between the soil particles. On the right side, I should have put that sample down 4 inches lower because yes, the tillage has beat that down, has beat up the pore spaces. And you can actually see in that tillage zone itself, we don't see the pore spaces there. Less water can soak in, more water is going to soak off or run off. So again, we want to build that soil structure and have it working for us. And I've done some infiltration work on the tilled soil, 2/10 to 4/10 water soaking in. Well, the soil survey says 2/10 to 6/10 is what it should be. On no-till in the wheel track, 6/10, where I haven't driven, I got soil structure all the way to the soil surface, over 4 inches per hour soaking in. So again, infiltration really pays off. Again, out your way a little bit more in southwest Nebraska, Bob Klein was out visiting after a 6-inch rainfall, took this picture. Farmer there says that was worthless rain. The 6 inches came too fast. It crusted my field. When am I going to be able to till it up and replant that sorghum? The runoff, the terraces over top. It was a worthless rain. His neighbor, a long-term no-tiller, beautiful soil structure, water soaked in, very little runoff, said it was a wonderful rain. I got a full soil moisture profile in June. Again, that's money in the bank. So again, it comes down to what are we doing in the systems approach? I put a question mark in the 6. You don't always get that 6-inch rain. But again, we see a lot more water infiltrating. So what does it mean? I will show you this yield number from year 2000. This is a year we had about 13 inches of rain during the growing season. I had a lot of neighbors harvesting 25 bushel beans, felt pretty good until they heard my no-till went 47. Again, systems approach long-term no-till. Grain sorghum that year, 61 versus 121. Again, more resilient soil. We got that water stored. We got that seed zone protected. That's where no-till is going to pay off. But it's going to be a long-term continuous no-till. What about in a good year? Southeast Nebraska, the T value for crop insurance for dryland corn is 120. Irrigated is 173, I believe now. This was a good year with good rainfall. Our till did 210 bushel corn. Feel pretty good until you see the no-till went 237. The thing I want to point out here, though, is look to the line. On the left side, the tilled doesn't have soil structure. The corn standability isn't as good because the corn roots couldn't hold it up with no soil structure there. The no-till, our standability issues have gone away since we've gone to no-till. So again, building a better soil structure. Again, it's continuous no-till. It's, this farmer says, yes, I no-till. I saved fuel. Yes, I saved labor, but he didn't save when it comes to soil life, soil biology. That's still tilled soil when it comes to crusting, when it comes to lack of soil life. It's going to be continuous no-till every crop, every year in the rotation. And we're seeing much more of that now in corn, soybean country. We're seeing where people are actually putting wheat in the rotations and get cover crops in. We're seeing where they can build some soil structure. This is from Dan Gillespie's farm, soil clod on the left side there, long-term no-till, 12 to 15 years. You can see some good soil beds, aggregates. On the right side, he walked across the fence, the conventional till neighbor. Again, continuous no-till is what makes it work on that systems approach. Done some work in the rainfall simulator, and out at Sidney, Nebraska in the 80 and 81, we actually ran it On Charlie Finster's long-term plots, on the plow ground, after 1 inch of water applied, we had runoff. And a lot of people said, see, you got to plow to open that up so the water soaks in. It took 20 minutes, the rainfall rate we're using. On the no-till side, we applied 3 3/4 inches of water before we saw any runoff. It took 90 minutes. His no-till had been in place for 13 years at that time. And so again, long-term continuous no-till really made a difference there for water out there in Sydney. That rainfall simulator was a little difficult to haul around for demonstrations, so we built small ones. This is one where on the 3 trays on the left are the same tilled soil. The difference is residue cover added back. The middle one has no residue. We can see a lot of soil in the jar there. The erosion from the raindrop impact is washed off. 30% cover reduced the runoff a little bit, reduced the erosion a little bit. The 100% cover really reduced raindrop impact, really reduced crusting, very little water coming off. Now on the right side, the first one next to the bare plot there is a bare no-till soil. Better soil beds, better soil aggregates, more water soaked in, so we had less runoff, less erosion. And the far right one there is actually grass. So it's sort of a no-till with a living plant. Very little runoff, very little soil movement. Now there we were putting on the water at a high rate, about 12 inches per hour. And so again, we expect runoff, but look at the differences there. The no-till soil structure made compared to tilled soil structure when it comes to no residue cover, or look at the big difference it made just having residue cover out there. So let's put a total on it, 5 to 12 extra inches of water. Let's use the low side, the 5 inches. From an irrigator, the variable cost in irrigation is about $15 an acre inch. If I can cut back 5 inches of irrigation, that's going to be $75 extra per acre. If I'm a dry lander, corn responds about 12 bushels per acre inch. That's 60 extra bushels. Beans, 3.5. Wheat, about 3. Again, that's extra yield. That's using the low side. And so again, I want to save that water. Again, when it comes to saving that water, there's a lot of you out there that panhandle. You used to be wheat fallow, you switched to no-till, you're doing continuous crop. There's some people even doing dryland corn out there because of that water savings, you're using the water. People south of you are used to be wheat fallow, they went to continuous crops. Some of them went to double crops. They're using that extra water. So we have to use the water that we save with no-till. Or some people use it to grow cover crops, protect that soil, build the soil, provide some carbon biomass. And again, if I'm a livestock person, that extra water can grow me something to graze the livestock on. This is from my friend of mine, Ralph Derps, who's down in Paraguay. Yes, it's a little higher rainfall area, but again, they're using that water for the soil. And their soil looks something like this. Ralph says that's what a long-term soil looks like. Again, that's soil biological life, soil health. What I want to do is keep my snow. I want to keep my residue. I want that residue standing to keep that snow in place. When it comes to soil biological life, here's from my long-term tillage plots. I went out there the day of disking in the early part of April for my first tillage trip, pulled up a stalk from the disc plot, pulled up a stalk from the no-till plot. The no-till plot is actually on the right. The soil biology is already cycling the roots into the system. The nutrients are becoming available for the next crop. The carbon is going into the system. On the left side is the disc plot. The root balls are still there. It's not being cycled. When it comes to nutrient cycling, I like the soil biology when it comes to soil health. And again, here we are, the residue standing, planting right down the row, planting soybeans. And here's what the field looked like a few weeks later. Beans are up and growing. That residue is now cycling when that next crop is growing. Now, the thing that started to really take off is the cover crops, increase that biological diversity. For me, when I learned to no-till back in 78, anything green out there and growing was a weed. No, green and growing is feeding the soil system. So maybe we're going to put some new crops in the rotation. Like I say, some corn, soybean people are putting wheat back in the rotation. Some people are putting forages in, either to graze it in the field or to harvest it and haul it out of the field. Others are just using cover crops themselves. And again, from our long-term tillage plots in that March or the April date when I went out to do my spring disking. On the right side is the fall chisel treatment. I'm getting ready to disc. A lot of people say you got to do tillage to get rid of the residue. On the left side is no-till with cover crop. That no-till with cover crop has fed the soil biology that the residue is being digested, being cycled. That cereal rye there is just breaking dormancy. It's going to grow me some carbon biomass. So again, feed the soil biology. And it seems counterintuitive to get rid of residue, plant a cover crop. Well, it's not because I want to grow some biomass from the cover crop. It's because I want to feed the soil biology, a healthier soil. Again, here's an example where corn immediately after harvest, over 200 bushel corn residue. The next spring, Austrian winter peas fixes some nitrogen for me, but look how much residue has already been cycled. Here is cereal rye on the left side in a corn, bean, wheat rotation, getting ready to plant soybeans. On the right side is corn, bean, wheat rotation with no cover crop. Again, the cover crops have given me some extra soil biology to cycle the residue. One of the keys is to have a good crop rotation. Top half are the cool season crops, wheat and peas. Bottom half, warm season crops, corn and soybeans. The left are grasses, the right are legumes or broadleaves. Think about the crop rotation. And so my tillage plots are corn, soybean rotation now. So to get all four crop types, my cover crops are Austrian winter peas and cereal rye. So I have all four crop types in real simple rotation to feed the soil biology. Our wheat stubble on the Rogers Memorial Farm, all of it gets cover crops. This is already planted a cover crop. You saw my drill earlier, the depth control is the depth gauge wheels behind the press wheels. It leaves the residue standing. I like that. The cover crop looks like that. It's a mix, it's a biological diversity. Notice the flowers in there, trying to attract the pollinators. I'm not after biomass, I'm after feeding the soil and bringing in other ecosystem services. And I use a cover crop that all winter kills. So next spring, I'm saving all my spring moisture. And here's the surprising part. I'm no-tilling there into wheat stubble with no volunteer wheat, no herbicide. So again, weed control. I'm having something growing there. That cover crop's paying off. I had to throw in this one. A friend of mine down in Kansas says, oh, I grow a little more biomass than you do. Well, again, when it comes to keeping the sun and wind off the soil surface, he has a lot more biomass there, but that used more water. So again, I start thinking about when is that cover crop going to be terminated? Closing thought on some temperature management. Let's keep the sun and wind off that soil surface. Tilled in the foreground, no-till in the background, grain sorghum, boy, it made a big difference. Here is the first day of summer. Soybeans growing in corn residue. June 21, I shot the side of the barn with our infrared thermometer, and there's the thermometer hanging on the barn. You can see it's 86 degrees. Shot the top of the soybean, 76 degrees. Well, yes, plants transpire. That water gives off evaporative cooling, cools the plants down. The bare soil, 133 degrees on an 86 degree day. I like meat. Throw a piece of steak on a grill for 5 minutes, turn it over 5 more minutes, get it up to 133 degrees. You're going to kill all the bacteria and make that meat safe to eat. What do that 133 degrees do to our soil life, our soil biology? That's on an 86 degree day. How about a 100 degree day where that number would read more like 150 or 160? So again, that soil temperature management. Top of the residue, 124. Pull away the residue, 76. Again, residue. Keep the temperature down, keeps the evaporation down. And for you people who say, I don't have enough rainfall, I had an opportunity a few years ago to South Australia and took this picture. This is a pasture. They're coming out of 2 weeks of 120 degree temperature with next to no rain. That's what their pasture looked like. Here's a producer visited. He says, I'm long-term no-tiller, but he harvested his residue. He used a shank opener on his drill. His shank opener did a lot of soil disturbance and had no residue. He had almost a dead soil there. That's the short residue in this picture. The tall residue was his neighbor had stripper head harvest. That tall residue kept the sun and wind off the soil surface. Not a living root there, just the fact of keeping the sun and wind off the soil surface. Again, look at the soil biological life. It's just like my cornstalk root balls. Which one had biology? It's running off the roots, cycling the residue. Which one did not? So again, keep that soil alive. Here's the one that really surprised me. Another guy was doing strips of cover crops, drug my foot, and it's to the row. Cover crops in an area of South Australia where they get 10 to 12 inches of annual rainfall, and they're using cover crops. This is another producer visited, and he was proud of this cover crop. He says, this cover crop has doubled my wheat yields. I looked at it and go, huh? That doesn't seem like much. And that's where I learned a lot more about soil health and, more importantly, soil biology. In that cover crop mix, he had some sunflowers. I pulled up sunflower plant. This is all the root system it had. Not much there for biomass, but that root was enough biological activity to keep the soil alive that it doubled his wheat yields. Where he had no cover crop, the soil was dry. There was no moisture. So even the cover crop they're using some moisture was keeping the soil alive and paid. If you got livestock, it'll pay even more if you can grow some biomass, but expect biomass to use water. Mary's going to talk about that this afternoon. Spend some time looking at the soil. Look at how deep roots are going, how much carbon we're putting into the soil. Remember those steps. Minimize the disturbance, keep it covered, a diversity, a living root. If you have livestock, integrate this as well. With that, I'm a little over. I started a little late. But Crop Watch, visit that. That's where all our crop production, crop scouting newsletter. And it's also where all our portal for our information for the university extension resources.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. Lots of wonderful pictures illustrating his points. We are also in the break time right now. So before anybody takes a few minutes break, would you first also take part in this quick poll? And I'll also, meanwhile, read a question to Paul. And we have about 4 minutes before the next speaker comes in. So if anybody needs a break, probably this is your 4-minute window. So Paul, a question is, keeping a short-term economics in mind, what is your recommendation on addressing a compaction layer on a no-till system?
When it comes to compaction, the first thing I do is to bring out a tile spade or sharpshooter, whatever you call them out there, and dig down. Is the compaction layer there? That is what a lot of people get concerned about. I actually look at the crop roots. If they're getting down through that layer, I'm not that concerned. What I want to do is stop the tillage, because that's probably what caused the compaction. When I start thinking about cover crops to break up compaction, a taproot crop is a good one. A lot of press on radishes. I myself not a fan of radishes. I like more like just even common rape. It's a lot cheaper seed, and I get a lot more roots going down through there. But I also like some fibrous roots there, the cereal rise or proso millet or anything with a fibrous root to build soil structure to reduce compaction in the future. If you do have the severe compaction problem, go for minimal soil disturbance, a straight shank ripper with a coulter in front of the shank, or maybe you rent a strip till tool to get rid of that compaction layer, plant strip till this year and switch to no-till next year. And so again, tillage can be an option if it's a root restricting layer. If it's not, let's let Mother Nature do it for us.
On a similar line of thought, a question I'm thinking of, I see quite a soil crusting in our areas. So let's say I haven't been managing or tilling quite a lot, and I'm already having crusting. So how do I go past it?
The key to reduce crusting is to reduce that raindrop impact. And so just get some residue out there on top. A crust, a lot of people say, well, I'm going to go out there with tillage, break that crust. The very next rainstorm they get, it reforms. And so the tillage is not the answer. Now, it is the answer if I have crop trying to emerge and I need to break that crust right then, but I don't need a full width rotary hoe, for instance. I only need the rotary hoe over the crop row itself on corn. I grew up northeast Nebraska without residue, and I spent a lot of time in the rotary hoe breaking crusts. But again, the key is to build the structure with water stable aggregates that won't crust. That takes time. The short-term quicker answer is get something there to absorb raindrop impact. And that something might even be oats planted as soon as I get to the field now, sprayed out when it gets a couple inches tall, because a couple inch tall oat plant's going to absorb the raindrop impact much more than bare soil does.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul.